Good morning, friends. Very grateful for the good number that is out this morning. It's not the brightest of days outside, but it's beaming in here with the beautiful thoughts that have been offered up and the excellent leadership we received this morning in worship. Thankful for your faith and your love and your devotion to God. That's why you're here, and it's very encouraging to see, and I commend you for it. I do also want to encourage you to get a bulletin. Today's the first Sunday, Lord willing, of this being a permanent feature again. We had discontinued it for a while in the midst of our vacancy from the services and various things, but we're back in operation now, and it's a very attractive bulletin. I commend Stephen Ogden for his work on the layout of this. That's one of the best I've seen in a church bulletin. And what's neat is we're going to have every Sunday for the next 11 months between the elders and deacons and myself. We each get 2 articles throughout that span. And so we're all going to take turns writing an article. And it's just going to be a real encouraging thing, I think, to hear the perspective of all things. This morning's article by Brother Jim is on perspective. But to see the perspective of the various men here. And so I'm just looking forward to that and reading and learning from that. But I encourage you to get that, and hopefully it will be a source of encouragement to you. What's interesting is last Sunday night after the service, Sister Kim Embry came up to me with her granddaughter Scarlett. And Scarlett wanted me to see her notes from the sermon, little 6-year-old Scarlett. And I was just so touched by that. Here's just a few of those, if you'll be able to see them. Apparently not. Okay. Well, this is awkward. I really need them to come up for some reason. Okay. All right, then. Am I missing something here? Okay, that's on, this is on, but that's not. So, anyway, Scarlett, I tried to hook you up, but apparently they don't want me to. And I just wanted people to see how touching it was to see something like that. And when I saw that, it just, it reminded me of the importance of what's being done up here. You know, the importance of what's taught, making sure the truth is taught. I mean, that's a very sobering thing to think about. Am I teaching the truth to all the young people who are here, to all the people who are listening to these lessons? But then I think about our influence, whether or not we're all being the example we should be to our young people. We have a lot of them here. We have 100 kids in our classes. It's a very big responsibility for us. And it just so happens that in light of the theme for this year, finding God's purpose for us, I have a lesson topic for the month. It won't necessarily be limited to one lesson, but it's on finding God's purpose for us in our example in the community. And even though the lesson this morning is not exclusively to that, it does fringe on that. And I will have several lessons this month that will fringe on that. And it's something for us to think about, the importance of our example and what we are doing for... No deal, huh? We're not going to have charts then? No deal? I sure didn't, did I? I just now remembered that. That stinks, man. That really does stink. Wow. That does stink. I didn't send the charts. I just now realized that. My bad, fellas. My bad. You should have reminded me. It's your fault. All right, then. Well, let's do this the old-fashioned way. We're just going to open the book, then, in Mark chapter 6, and we'll go this way. That stinks, because I really had some neat charts, I thought, that would probably help us with this thought. But in Mark chapter 6, I want to see something here. And in this setting of Mark chapter 6, we have here John the Baptist, who is in jail, in prison at this time. And this is his last day on earth. This is the day he died. And the reason he died was because he was preaching a lesson that was not popular. He had taught the king that he did not have a right to be married to Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And it doesn't say what Herod thought of that, but it does say what his wife thought about that. And she didn't like it. And she wanted to kill John for it. But Herod feared John because he saw him as a prophet of God. Nevertheless, he still held him in prison because of his wife's influence. And it says in verse 19 that Herodias held it against John and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he had heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod was on his birthday, who gave a feast for his nobles, the officials and officers and chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter, gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away the corpse and laid it in a tomb. A lot of stuff happening there, a lot of neat stories for us to think about. But I want us to consider for a fact that here's the king, and he did not want to do any real harm to John the Baptist. He saw him as a prophet. But his mind was convinced to do otherwise. And we see what happened. That here he's having this birthday party and all of his officials are there, and this young girl comes in and she's dancing. She's dancing provocatively, she's probably dressed provocatively, and they're celebrating, they're most likely drinking, and his thoughts change. And he says, "Okay, what do you want? I'll give you half my kingdom." He was that stimulated by the scene. And of course, we see eventually it would lead to the beheading of John the Baptist. Even though he didn't want to do that initially, because of his oath and because of the people who were there, he changed his mind and went ahead and killed the man. But what put him in that position? It was several things, no doubt. It would have been most likely the inebriation, the intoxication. That could have been a factor in this. But it also states, though, that she was dancing. And because she was dancing, it provoked certain thoughts within him. And that, of course, led to the end of John the Baptist. Now, what we have to understand is that if we're going to live for God, we have to be people who are morally upright and pure. But let me ask you, when you look at this scene, who was at fault? Who was at fault? Well, we say, it had to be the girl. I mean, she came in there and acted that way and got those men all stirred up. It was her fault. And that's right. She does have a part in all of this. But is she the only one at fault? Well, no. The men were there. The king and his guests were there. And they had the responsibility of controlling their own desires and not looking at things they shouldn't have looked at. So no, it wasn't just her fault. They had a fault at it too. They had responsibility in it too when they saw this girl moving the way she was moving. So was it just them? Well, you could probably see that even the mother had something to do with this in that she condoned the behavior of her daughter and took advantage of that. And of course, carrying out her hatred toward John. All of these people were at fault. All of them. And yet when you see in Romans chapter 13, the Bible teaches that you and I have to walk like Christ. Let us walk properly as in the day, is what it says. In Romans chapter 13, in verse 13, let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness. Well, possibly Herod and his guests could show the need to avoid that. That when you're given to intoxicants, it's going to impair your judgment, going to put you in situations that are not good. So revelry and drunkenness, this is in verse 13, Romans 13, not in lewdness and lust. Well, who fits the bill on that? Well, this young girl who's moving around like she was, she fits the bill on that. And then it says, not in strife and envy. Well, who would fit the bill on that? Well, I would think the young girl's mother, Herodias, and the hatred she had for John would be a good illustration of that. But then it says in verse 14, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. Now listen to other translations on this verse. The New American Standard says, make no provision. Now, how did you do that? I didn't send it. I've been up here the whole time. You went on there? Thank you, brother. You were the man. Okay. Well, how about that? We're way behind. If you're going to start it, at least start it on time, brother. Let's keep on going. Very good, brother. Thank you so much. Okay. We going? All right. So we see that these people can illustrate all of this. But notice where it says to make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. It says in the New American Standard, make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lust. The Christian Standard Bible says, make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. The New International says, do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. In other words, you and I have to live in such a way to where we're not stimulating our desires to act in a sinful way. And we cannot go looking for ways to do this. Do not think about, I love that in the new NIV, do not think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. But the contrast is that instead we walk properly as in the day. We walk like Christ. And so for a few minutes, I'd like for us to consider what that means and see in this story the great illustration of how we're not to act and how we're not to respond to our desires. And let me just keep going with this. Number one, we have to be people who control our desires. Now that's where Herod messed up. You know, Herod and these guests, it says in Mark chapter 6 that they were all affected by this girl and the way she was acting. It says that in verse 22, when she came in and danced, she pleased Herod and those who sat with him. And that's when he said, "You whatever you want." All right, so Jesus teaches us that especially as men, we have the great task of controlling our desires. Now, obviously that applies to women as well. But the difference is men are more visually oriented. This is the way God made us. For whatever reasons, I have a few thoughts on that. Nevertheless, the bottom line is God made us to be highly affected by the things we see. That's the way we are as men. And it says in Matthew chapter 5 that our task is to control these desires and to not let them to run rampant. It says in Matthew chapter 5 where Jesus says that you have heard it said of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so the rule is still the same. Don't commit adultery. And under the old law, he said, of course, to avoid that. Jesus says, well, it's not enough to just avoid it physically. You've got to avoid it mentally. You can't even go there in your mind. And Peter says that it's possible for men to have eyes full of adultery. And the reason that's the case is because they have hearts trained in covetous practices. And that's what the Bible's teaching us. And that is a great challenge for us, especially as men. But Jesus, of course, is holding us accountable. That yes, he gave us these desires, but he holds us accountable for controlling them. And in this case, Herod and those men, they should have looked away. They shouldn't have been in that scene if they were people committed to holiness. Now, this is by far one of the best illustrations I've seen or can think about on this. That what's a magnet? You have a magnet, north and south poles, so on and so forth. But whenever metal is around magnet, it's just going to operate that way. It's just automatically going to attract. Metal's automatically going to attract to the magnet, and the magnet's automatically going to pick it up. That's the way it's designed. And God has made us as men to automatically be attracted to women. 99.9% of us are attracted to women. That's the way we're wired. That's the way He designed it. Possibly for procreation. He wanted the earth to be filled and multiplied with people, and so maybe that's part of it. I don't say that's the only reason, but it's certainly part of it. That God made it to where we are attracted to women. And when we're acting within our natural desires, that's the way it is, and women have natural desires for men. Now, the problem is this right here. We live in a world where very few respect that, where you have a lot of people working against those desires. You have a lot of things happening in the world around us where there are sensual desires, where it's a problem for men because so many things are appealing to his visual senses and his desires. In Proverbs chapter 7, you have the task of avoiding adultery outlined in this text. And he says that there is a young man who put himself in a position to where he was going to be tempted excessively. And it's because he went to the wrong side of town. He was looking for trouble, and trouble showed up. He found it. And he found it in the form of a woman. And this woman was dressed the part. She was dressed as a harlot. She not only looked the part, she acted the part by appealing to his senses and appealing to his pride and his ego. And you can read in Proverbs chapter 7, it says in verse 10, there was a woman that met him with the attire of a harlot. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean when a woman is dressed like a prostitute? Well, she's dressed in such a way to where she is trying to activate this. She's trying to appeal to this side of man who is going to be visually stimulated by the way she looks. And it's going to appeal to what? His sexual desires. She looks the part, she's dressed the part, and then she's acting the part. Saying that, you come on home with me, my husband's gone, no one's going to know. It's just you and me. And that's what she's doing. She's appealing to him to act on those desires. Now, a man of God is to do what? Avoid that corner, right? Don't go looking for it. But certainly our task is to be people who control the mind, who control the heart. And I believe there are a lot of men here who are committed to that, where we know the challenge, and yet we're committed to our wives, and we're committed to this level of godliness that God wants us to have. And here's how God tells us to respond to these desires. Because He put them in us, okay? These desires are real. But He tells us that He wants us to use them and limit them to marriage, to save them for your spouse. That's where it's appropriate. That's where it's proper. That to avoid sexual morality, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband, is what it says in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2. And that's a beautiful thing. You know, if we were to bring in bags of dirt and soil and dump them on this carpet, you know, here we just had it cleaned. The carpet's cleaned just within the last month. But we bring in bags and wheelbarrows of dirt, and we just dump the soil right there on the carpet. What would we say about that? We would all say, well, that is wrong. It's dirty. And the reason it's dirty and wrong is because it's out of place. Whereas if you're trying to build a garden at home, you would love the rich soil. You would love to have it there brought in because that's where it belongs. It's in the right environment. And it's being used the way God intended it, which is in in the earth and in the garden and in producing life. But it's only dirty when it's out of place. Sexual desires are from God, and they can be used properly when they're in marriage, when it's between a husband and wife. But when we take it out of marriage and use it elsewhere, then it becomes filthy. It becomes dirty because it's not being used the way God designed it. And so we see, number one, in walking properly, we're going to live like Christ. Well, number one, men especially, we have to control our desires. Women too, but especially we as men. Why? Because we have so many things around us that are working against us. I came across an article that I thought was pretty interesting. It was from a few years ago, but I've happened to read it again this week and was reminded of it. But it was in regard to table tennis in China. Very popular sport. In fact, of all nations, that nation is most interested in table tennis, ping pong. But the problem is, especially at the Olympics, that there's such a small following for women's table tennis and a huge following for men. We see this with other sports, with basketball, whatever. We see a larger following with the men. Well, they decided that we got to somehow get more people in the seats. And their solution was to have the athletes, the women, dress in skimpy clothing and tight clothing that reveal the curves, that reveal the body, to try and bring more people in to watch the event. Now that's the world we live in, where it's always coming at us to try and get us to misuse our eyes and misuse our desires. But God holds us accountable for doing our part. Let me keep moving, please. In walking properly, we have to be people who avoid seductive behavior. Now, this is what we can see from that young girl who was dancing before Herod. She could say, well, hey, that's their fault. You know, they're being dirty old men having those thoughts. That's on them. And part of that's true. Man is responsible for controlling himself. That's true. But don't you know that God holds a woman like that accountable for doing her part, for acting in a way that would incite lust. In other words, where you are encouraging people. The word incite means to rouse or inflame or stimulate. And what God tells us is that the burden is on us to avoid dressing and acting in such a way to where we are lewd. That's the term God says. That if we're going to go to heaven, you and I have to avoid adultery, fornication, uncleanness, and lewdness. And these terms refer to that which is moral. That to be unclean is to be morally impure, or to be lewd is to be sensual. And what God is saying is that we cannot act like this girl acted in inflaming those desires in other people and still be innocent. He holds us accountable. Now here's what's so challenging about this. That this is true even if we don't intend to do that. That if our behavior is still causing that or promoting that, that term is encouraging us to discontinue that behavior. That if we are acting or dressing in such a way to where it is causing these extra thoughts or provoking these thoughts, we need to avoid that behavior. Now, I don't doubt for 1 minute that the girl's intent in going to that party and dancing that way was to provoke those thoughts, without question. But if we are acting in a way that still encourages that, we've got to discontinue that. Now, here's a great illustration of this and how we're still held accountable. Even if our motive is not there, we're still held accountable for what our behavior is doing. A great illustration of this is to go to our Kentucky website, .gov, Kentucky State website, and look at the responsibilities of visitors who are going to the prisons or jails. A lot of different things are said there. But don't you know there's a dress code? There's a behavior code required of those who would come and visit the inmates. And part of that code says things like, in regard to women, now it's not just with women, men have some restrictions as well, but women, notice this, you have to have undergarments on, and they go into detail on that. You cannot wear things that reveal the midriff or cleavage. Your blouses are to be buttoned. No halter tops. No hot pants. I don't think that's stuff coming out of the dryer either. I think it's talking about something else. No hot pants. Of course, my thighs rub, so I don't know if that's what it's talking about when you walk. I don't know. That may not be it. But no hot pants, no short skirts, and no see-through clothing. No sleeveless garments are allowed. Shorts shall not be more than 4 inches above the knee. And a visitor shall not wear spandex, the yoga pants, things like that. Now, why in the world would our government say you cannot go into the prisons dressed like this? Even though you might say, well, it's not my intent. My intent's not to do any harm. They won't let you through the door dressed like that because that type of attire is going to cause trouble. It's going to incite desires. And when these desires are inflamed, people are going to behave the way they shouldn't. And it's just going to cause trouble. And so our government says, don't even go there. Don't even come here dressed like that. Even though your intentions may be innocent, if it's causing lewdness, or if it's stimulating lust, we're to avoid that. And you can say, well, hey, that's their fault. You know, these men have to control their thoughts. It's on them. Well, no. Even our government says it's on you. That if you're acting that way or dressing that way, you've got to avoid engaging in that behavior. And that's exactly what God is telling us. That we have to be people who profess godliness in how we dress. When you go back and read the account of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, in the aftermath of their sin, they felt guilt, fear, shame. They tried hiding from God. But it says their eyes were opened. Okay, before that, they were like little children. You know, children can run around naked. They don't care. It doesn't bother. They have no judgment on that. And that's how they were as adults. They just did not affect them. But once they sinned, their eyes were open, and they knew they were naked. And one of the first things they did was they sewed fig leaves together to try and cover themselves because they were ashamed. Now, later on in Genesis, in verse 21, it says that the Lord came in, and he made coverings for them from animal skin. He made coverings for them. Now, you think about that for a second. What do you think those fig leaves look like? When they made their clothing for themselves, what do you think they were covering? I would imagine they were covering the essentials, right? But notice what God did. God came in and said, no, that's not enough. You've got to be further clothed. Now, what's interesting about this is that of all of God's creatures, the humans have to be clothed. We're not born with our clothes. We need to add clothing to ourselves. But we don't need to have clothing that just covers the essentials. God is showing through these people, who are the only 2 people in the world, that humans have to be clothed properly. It's not enough to just cover the essentials. You've got to be clothed properly in order to be consistent with God's will. That's what he was showing. He was setting a precedent through these people of how we're to be clothed properly. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it says that if you're going to profess godliness, that is, if you're going to be a person who walks with God, walks with Christ, you and I have got to dress properly. He doesn't say how short is too short or how too tight is too tight. He doesn't go into detail for us. But he does give us principles. And he tells us to avoid certain things and that we are to profess certain things by how we act. Women who are going to profess godliness are to do so with good works, but they're to do so in modest apparel, is what he says in verse 9. Modest behavior, modest apparel. And so in avoiding seductive behavior, we've got to be people who profess godliness in how we dress. Now, I showed this several months ago when we were doing one of our when we were shut down and having to do virtual services. And I showed this in an evening lesson. So chances are only 12 of you saw this. There's a good chance. I mean, that's just the way it is. And I showed this in asking about this picture. Now, when you see this picture, now, many of you have already seen this from that sermon, but is this a picture of a nudist retreat or a church service? Or is it both? I mean, nowadays you can't rule anything out. So is that a picture of a nudist service or church service or what? And the person who took the photo was taking a picture of a bridal party. And of course they were just saying, look at this. I mean, my goodness. And they were making a fair point, because if you're just looking at that, what comes to mind? Can you tell a difference between women dressed like this and people at a nudist colony? Can you tell the difference? No. I mean, at the first glance, how's it look? But my question is this: is that promoting godly thoughts? Is that professing godliness by being dressed like this? Are they more like Adam and Eve with the fig leaves, or Adam and Eve with the tunics and the coverings? Which one is that more resemble? Most likely the one that God had to clothe, right? Now think about that, because that's an honest response to this picture. But what about this? What about this? What do these garments show? What do they express? You know, when you wear a suit, a bathing suit, and it's really no different than underwear in terms of what it covers, and you wear that in public for other men to see, or in public for other people to see, what does that say? What is it doing to other people? Or when you wear tight-fitting clothes that show every curve of the body, what's it doing to people? Well, here's what it's doing. It's this right here. We're just wired to look at that stuff. It's the way it is. We're just wired to, it's going to get our attention, especially as guys. Now, again, is the burden just on them? No, the burden's on us. We've got to control ourselves. Make a covenant with our eyes that we will not use them in a way that's inappropriate. But isn't the Bible teaching us that you have to act in such a way to where you don't encourage that, inflame that by how you dress and how you act? And it's not just the women. The men have to be careful of this as well. You know, shirts that reveal things and are suggestive of things. And it's not just the visual temptation, it's what it associates itself with. Are you associating yourself with women who are professing godliness when you are given to modest apparel yourself as a man? You see, this is what God's telling us, to avoid seductive things like this, to act in a loving manner. That's what Romans 13 and verse 10 says, to love your neighbor, do no harm to them. Well, think about this. Is it a loving thing to put them in temptation? Suppose Brother Matt comes over to the house and he says, hey, because Matt and I are like this, but Matt says, hey, look, I'll come over, but the doctor says I've got to avoid all sweets, okay? Blood sugar's out of control. I got to avoid processed sugar. So no problem, brother. Come on over. Well, they come over, and they come to our house, and we have all this stuff on the table. You know, you have the chocolate cake, the chocolate icing, the mint chocolate shakes, and all of these things on the table presented to have them over. And he says, hey, brother, what are you doing to me, man? I'm supposed to avoid this stuff. And my response is, well, avoid it. That's on you. You can avoid it. You don't have to give in. That's on you. That's your problem if you're tempted by this. I want to do this anyway. What would be the more loving thing to do? The more loving thing to do was to not invite him over if you're going to have this type of stuff, right? To not bring that problem into his life. And he and I are like this. We'll be tempted by things like this. What's the more loving thing to do when we're wearing attire or acting in such a way to where it's going to promote lust? What's the more loving thing to do? The more loving thing to do is to avoid acting in that way. That's what God is wanting us to do. And my goodness, you see the battle that men have, so why encourage that? Why go beyond the realm of leading them down temptation? Let me say this real quickly in closing. And that is, who acted improperly in this setting? Was it the girl? Yes. Was it the men? Yes. Was it the mother? Well, yes. Obviously, she took advantage of her daughter in the response for the dance, but also in condoning that behavior. Let me say this, because this is important, that we as parents have a responsibility to train our children to be godly and to be holy and to avoid things that are going to lead to lewdness. That's what it says. You no longer live like this. 1 Peter 4 and verse 3. You don't live in lewdness. We used to, but now we don't. And that, my friends, is a very serious thing to consider. I have here a list of things that I received from a member here whose father is a preacher. And this preacher was counseling a young man who is committed to Christ, trying to live a Christian life. But he's a young Christian in his 20s who is recovering from pornography and homosexual tendencies. And he was asked the question, what would your words be to what parents need to know? He says things like, be knowledgeable about the sexual effects of one's body in the eyes of another, not just as a child, but as an adult as well. He said early exposures of nakedness are small conditionings of the heart at home and in public. He says not being exposed to some evils, like pornography or violence or abuse or drinking or lying, does not guarantee you or someone you love will not practice it. He says train boys to be biblical leaders and girls to be biblical examples of submission by the authority of God. Be convicted in your faith and standard by God's word. He goes on to say, be accountable to someone. Be associated with godly people who can call you out in trust and confidence. But the very first thing he said was this: be fully clothed as a boy or girl at all times. Immodesty is a problem at home, at ball games, in any public fashion, not just beachgoers. In other words, he's saying the thing that leads a person down that path is seeing things in the way people are dressed and act. That's on us. That's on us to encourage people not to go down that path. And these are things to think about. You know, if we're wearing swimwear, especially in the presence of other mixed company that's going to inflame lust, is that a loving thing to do? Or our athletics. You know, somehow we think, well, because it's a sport, we can bypass all these regulations and responsibilities. I'm not sure about that. There are certain sporting events I will not watch because of the problem it could pose in me being a guy. Why? Why would I put myself in a situation like that? And the same thing with dancing. Is all dancing wrong? I mean, even the Bible says there's a time to mourn and a time to dance, and there is jovial, innocent, harmless dancing like you do with your kids. And even part of cultures. I go to Samoa. Well, I was going every year, but my mom's from there. Dancing's part of that culture. I see that. There's harmless, innocent dancing, but then there's the bad stuff. There's stuff that's going to influence people in their thoughts. And even though we may not mean anything by it, if it's producing that, that's the problem. And the same thing can be going with public pools or beaches and things like that. Don't have a problem with going to the beach per se or anything like that. I love it. It's relaxing. But we have to be careful about putting ourselves in an environment where we're going to be tempted or we're going to cause others to be tempted. And we as parents have that responsibility to protect our children. I mean, the guy's 20-something years old, and he says the first thing that a person needs to think about is how they're dressed. And what about it as parents? Which is easier, teaching a child to avoid inappropriate dress or teaching a teenager? You see, we need to be people who train our children at a young age to walk properly with the Lord. You've listened very patiently, and I appreciate it so much. There was a lot I had to say, and there's more I could have said. But hopefully we see the importance of walking like Christ in how we dress and in how we act. You know, your body's going to grow old. It's going to die and eventually return to dust. But the inner man is to be renewed day by day, and that spirit is going to be accountable to God forever. And since that's the case, we should be people who enhance and emphasize the spiritual man. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, putting on fine apparel, but rather let it be the hidden person of the heart with incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. And so I hope that's something we can think about in our relationship with God today. Thank you, friends. If you're here and you're not a child of God, we always like to encourage people to have all their sins washed away. And that's the beautiful thing about all this. As we sang about in our first song this morning, the love of God. The love of God. He does love us. He does. But He wants us to be people who love Him in return. And if you're not a Christian, we encourage you with this song to think about that and respond to this beautiful invitation of being added to the body of Christ. If you don't understand that, we ask for an opportunity. But if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, please come to Him as we stand and sing.